The man known to history as Edmund Burke was most likely born on the 12th of January 1730 in the city of Dublin, the capital of Ireland. Another tradition holds that he was born in Shanballymore in County Cork in the south of Ireland, and it has also been argued that his year of birth could be 1728 or 1729. His father was Richard Burke, a lawyer who worked within the Court of Exchequer in Dublin and who was a successful upper-middle-class member of the gentry as a result. The Burkes traced their ancestry back to the Burkes of Connacht in the west of Ireland, a region which had been conquered by the Anglo-Norman de Burghs in the medieval period. Hence, Burke hailed from a family that had been prominent in Ireland for half a millennium. Edmund's mother was Mary Burke, though her maiden name was Nagle, an Irish kinship group. She originally hailed from Cork in the south of the island and was a Roman Catholic, in contrast to Richard Burke, who was a Protestant. The couple had a tortuous family history, with at least 5 and perhaps as many as 9 children dying during pregnancy or infancy. Edmund did nevertheless grow up with some siblings who survived into their adult years, a sister, Juliana, and brothers Richard and Garrett. Edmund spent much of his earliest years living in the south of Ireland with Mary Burke's Nagle family in County Cork, moving between there and his parents' home in the capital on Arran Quay in Dublin. Where he was at a given time was shaped by the terms of the law courts in Dublin, and when Richard Burke was busy, the children were shipped off to Cork. Despite his upbringing there, the Catholicism of his mother's family did not brush off on Edmund, and he became a Protestant like his father. A practical decision, perhaps, in a time and place where one's religion determined their potential status in life in the future. Burke's education began in Cork in his younger years, when he was given lessons in Latin and other subjects by an Irish tutor by the name of O'Halloran. Thereafter, he was sent for more formal schooling in County Kildare, not far west of Dublin. Here, he attended a school run by the esteemed educator Abraham Shackleton in the town of Ballitore, beginning there in 1741 when he was just 11, and leaving 3 years later to begin attending Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland's only university at the time, at the precociously young age of 14. Burke grew up in a country of contrasts. By the 18th century, the military resistance to British colonisation by the Irish Catholic lords who had dominated much of the country for centuries had been broken through successive wars in the 16th and 17th centuries. Each conflict had ended with land confiscations and plantations which transferred the vast majority of Irish land into the hands of a small clique of Protestant newcomers. These made up only 10% to 15% or so of the population, but they now became the dominant political, social and economic class, ruling over an economically marginalised class of Irish smallholders. Burke came from the middle of this world. His family were resoundingly middle class, and the Burke surname indicated he came from an Anglo-Irish family which was ultimately of medieval English origin, but which had Gaelicised very substantially in centuries gone by. As a result, many members of his extended family were Catholic, while others were Protestants. This dual Anglo-Irish identity would shape his writings and political views over time as he became an individual who, above all else, was capable of seeing both sides of political arguments. Moreover, although his career was largely to be played out in England, he would intermittently become involved in Irish political issues over the years. Burke's arrival to Trinity College, Dublin in 1744 clearly gives the lie to claims his accusers would level at him in later years that he was a Roman Catholic, something which cannot have been the case as Trinity did not allow Catholics to study there in the 18th century. He spent 4 years at the university, becoming a college scholar in 1746 and earning his degree in 1748. He was a decent, though far from exemplary student at Trinity. Like many a great writer and thinker, he was not well suited to a structured form of learning, but instead excelled at extracurricular activities, becoming well known for his participation in the college's debating societies and for his writing on history and politics. In his final year, he wrote for a newspaper, The Reformer, while he also developed an interest in poetry and literature. In short, one gets the sense of a figure who had a wide range of interests and whose mind was searching for which of these he might best excel at: philosophy, history, politics, and literature, all being possible avenues of exploration. His mind was still not made up when he left Trinity, and after a year or so of writing for various publications in Dublin, he accepted the advice and pressure of his father that he should follow him into the law courts as a profession. Thus, in 1750, Burke sailed from Ireland and headed to London to begin studying at the Middle Temple there, one of the ancient Inns of Court, the lawyer-finishing schools in the English capital. In England, Burke's ill-suited disposition for a legal career soon became apparent. His father supported him financially while he attended the Middle Temple, but unfortunately Edmund did little attending. Much of his time was spent away from London, though he was not a layabout. While he might not have been inclined towards finishing his legal training, he was working on various projects through the early and mid-1750s. One of these was a work of history entitled An Account of the European Settlements in America, a text which explored the history of settlement in the New World by the Spanish, English, French, and others. The context in which it was written was the outbreak of war between the French and English in North America from 1754 onwards, a clash which would end nearly a decade later with the ceding of what is now Eastern Canada to the British. Burke co-authored this work with his London-based cousin, William, or Will, Burke, a figure with whom he developed a lifelong friendship at this time. By the time they set to work on the text, Burke had concluded that he would not finish his studies at the Middle Temple, and in 1755 he finally informed his father that he did not intend to continue as a lawyer and was instead committed to writing on historical, philosophical, and political subjects henceforth. Burke's writing career, as it began to develop, strayed increasingly away from history, though he did retain an interest in the topic, and more towards analysis of the great philosophical and political questions of the day. An understanding of the broader context he was writing in is useful here. The 18th century was a period in Europe's history known as the Enlightenment. This was an intellectual and social movement which built on previous movements in Europe, such as the humanist Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries and the scientific revolution of the 17th century, while also emerging as a reaction to the religious reformations of the 16th century and the appalling bloodshed they had resulted in across the continent in a century and a half of religious wars. Enlightenment thinkers aimed to move away from understanding society through the prism of religion and towards a more scientific way of assessing how society should be run and morality introduced into the management of individual states. Many Enlightenment thinkers also questioned the political systems of their own countries, calling for greater political representation and a destruction of old class-based politics. On the continent, the Enlightenment's greatest figures included contemporaries of Burke's like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Denis Diderot. Britain would have individuals like John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith, while Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin emerged as major Enlightenment figures across the Atlantic. Ireland also produced its own Enlightenment scholars, notably two near contemporaries of Burke's, Jonathan Swift and George Berkeley, while Oliver Goldsmith, a major Anglo-Irish poet of the time, was a friend of Burke. Burke's literary career could be said to have peaked early. Two of his most acclaimed texts were written in the mid-1750s during this formative period of his life. The first of these was A Vindication of Natural Society, or A View of the Miseries and Evils Arising to Mankind from Every Species of Artificial Society. Published in 1756, The Vindication was effectively a satirical work, though of such a subtle kind that Burke had to include a preface to the second edition, published in 1757, explaining that he did not mean everything he had said literally. In it, Burke contrasted what was termed natural society with political society, one being life in the state of nature without state intervention, the other being society governed by politics and all the burdens of modernity. This mode of inquiry has a lengthy history, having been central to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan a century earlier, yet it also ranged over other topics, notably on religion and the concept of deism, a sphere of Christian thought which rejects revelation as a way of knowing God and instead tries to reconcile scientific empiricism with religious belief. The Vindication is a complicated text, one which points to both Burke's learning even as a still relatively young man and also the sophistication of the Enlightenment arguments he was feeding into. Some scholars have argued that it evinces the first traces of what we would now call political anarchism. The second text which Burke wrote during this period is, arguably, his most important work. A philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful was published in 1757, just a year after the Vindication. It is a philosophical treatise, one which was concerned with the subject of aesthetics, but also epistemology, a branch of philosophy concerned with how it is that we gain knowledge. In it, Burke is concerned, as the title suggests, with what might be termed sublime and what might be termed beautiful. Burke argued that things are beautiful which are aesthetically pleasing, such as a painting or a flower, whereas things that are sublime are those that are elevated to a greater height of aesthetic impact, but in being so also have the ability to cause emotional damage or disorder. The text is viewed today as being a seminal work in the transition towards a more emotive form of cultural inquiry and the development of the concept of Romanticism, something which would have fallen into the sphere of the sublime according to Burke's categorizations. A Philosophical Inquiry was an important text for decades to come. It especially influenced the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the foremost figure of the German Enlightenment, while elements of Burke's thought can be traced through the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, a century later. The publication of The Vindication and A Philosophical Inquiry in quick succession put Burke in a position to make a living from his writing. In the spring of 1757, he was issued with a contract by the publisher Robert Dodsley to begin researching and writing a lengthy history of England, with the project aimed at providing a wide survey of the country from the first arrival of the Romans under Julius Caesar and Claudius down to the end of the House of Stuart with the death of Queen Anne in 1714. Burke began work on the text, and by 1760 he had produced an account down as far as the issuing of the Magna Carta in the early 13th century, but thereafter he abandoned the project, although the unfinished text was published in 1812 after he died. A year after he began the history project, the same publishing house hired him to edit a periodical entitled the Annual Register. All in all, he had firmly established himself as a writer of repute within a short period of ending his studies at the Middle Temple. Burke also married at this time to Jane Nugent in March 1757. She came from a noted Roman Catholic political dynasty from the Dublin region in Ireland. Their two sons, Richard and Christopher, were born either side of 1758, with just 10 months between them. Burke's reputation as a man of letters and intellect had been burnished enough by his published work in the second half of the 1750s that in 1759 he acquired a post as the secretarial assistant to William Gerard Hamilton, a member of the English Parliament who had made an early reputation for himself with his maiden speech at just 26 years of age, one which led to his being widely praised for his oratorical abilities. Burke would spend several years in the employ of Hamilton, who somewhat fortuitously was appointed as Chief Secretary of Ireland in 1761, and so Edmund returned to his homeland for a time. There he was able to influence Hamilton in some of his policies, the Chief Secretary being anxious to have his assistant's insights into the country he had grown up in and knew so well. Though he was intermittently back in England during the years that followed, when in Dublin he lobbied for an easing of the penal laws against Catholics, which he viewed as being abhorrent to his liberal politics, even as a Protestant, though one with a Catholic mother and wife. He met with no success in this, though, as Ireland, particularly the south of the country and the province of Munster, was undergoing a period of intense agrarian violence as a Catholic organisation known as the White Boys attacked the farms and estates of wealthy Protestant landholders, leading to a renewed surge in anti-Catholic sentiment amongst the Protestant elite. When Hamilton was dismissed from his position as Chief Secretary in 1764, Burke left Ireland and returned to England. A split between the two men followed in 1765 after a heated argument, and Burke once again found himself at a loose end. Burke's time as assistant to Hamilton was, in some senses, an apprenticeship for a more senior political career. Having left his service, he was quickly hired by a more senior political figure. This was Charles Watson Wentworth, 2nd Marquess of Rockingham. Rockingham was the same age as Burke, but he was already a senior political figure amongst the Whigs, the more liberal-leaning political party in England, and the opponents of the Tories or Conservatives. In the summer of 1765, he became Prime Minister of Britain and employed Burke as one of his private secretaries. Through Rockingham's patronage, Burke was soon seconded into Parliament when a seat was found for him representing the constituency of Wendover. Thus did his political career begin. He quickly made his mark, establishing himself as a gifted orator in an age when the ability to speak well in Parliament was at a premium. In time, he would emerge as arguably the most accomplished speaker in the British Parliament of the second half of the 18th century. Over the next 17 years, he would also become part of a tight-knit group of Whig MPs who were closely allied with Rockingham and his policy platform, such that they became known as the Rockingham Whigs. One of Burke's principal concerns in his first years in Parliament was with Irish policy. The country there continued to experience heightening levels of agrarian violence, with new pockets of turmoil arising in the southern parts of the province of Ulster in the north of Ireland, particularly around County Armagh. There were also issues concerning trade duties and customs on the wool and soap trades, as well as the size of the army establishment. Burke established himself as a firm opponent of the policies of Viscount Townshend, Viceroy of Ireland between 1767 and 1772. His ties to his homeland were also maintained through inheritance. In 1766, following the death of his brother Garret, Edmund inherited a large estate in County Cork and headed there to sort out his personal and financial affairs. The trip was also the occasion of the city of Galway granting him the freedom of the city, an honour which pointed towards his growing status as an Anglo-Irishman. Burke retained his seat representing Wendover in the 1768 elections and continued to spend the next few years working on a wide variety of issues as a Rockingham Whig. He brought his pen to bear on these, composing 2 treatises in 1769 and 1770 entitled Observations on a Late State of the Nation and Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents. These concerned numerous policy issues of the day, but one of the foremost was the matter of royal interference in the workings of Parliament. Britain had developed in the course of the 17th century from a country where the Crown ruled with periodic consultation of Parliament to become a constitutional monarchy in which Parliament governed the state and the Crown was the more junior partner. Over time, the King or Queen of the day was playing an even smaller role in the 18th century. However, George III, who had become the monarch in 1760, seemed committed to playing a role in affairs which some believed was overly intrusive in Parliament's independence. In the Thoughts, Burke presented the Whig or Liberal case that the Crown needed to stop its excessive role in government. He met with no such result, though. From 1770 onwards, Lord North was the Prime Minister of Britain, and he was closely connected with George III and the Crown. The early 1770s were significant years in Burke's career as an opponent of government. Throughout this period, he was fulsome in his criticism of the Tories, or Conservatives, under North in their overly close management of state affairs with the King and his advisers, calling for a more liberal approach to affairs where Parliament would debate the making of policy openly. He also took principled stands on international affairs, notably the first partition of Poland, whereby Prussia, Russia and Austria began dismantling the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and dividing it up between them, claiming that it not only impacted on the balance of power in Europe, but also robbed the Polish people of their liberties. He was, in this respect, ever the Anglo-Irishman, conscious of his country's own dual position as both a constituent part of the British state and as a colony. When elections came in 1774, there was an opportunity for Burke to switch to represent the more significant constituency of Bristol, which at that time was still one of the largest cities in Britain, though soon to be eclipsed with the emergence of the industrial centres of the north around Manchester and Newcastle. Having successfully won the election, he delivered a famous speech to the electors of the city in which he declared, "Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, which interests each must maintain as an agent and advocate against other agents and advocates, but Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good, resulting from the general reason of the whole. You choose a member indeed, but when you have chosen him, he is not a member of Bristol, but he is a member of Parliament." It was a significant statement of his intention to act in the national rather than the local interest, and he held to his word, most notably clashing with his own constituents when he promoted the principle of free trade between Britain and Ireland, a concept which the merchants of Bristol believed would hurt their commercial interests. Nevertheless, Burke would continue to represent Bristol throughout the 1770s. While Burke was already a well-established politician in England by the dawn of the 1770s, his role in British political life would really come to the fore in the nation's parliamentary politics during this decade as a result of events across the Atlantic. Britain had begun colonizing the eastern seaboard of North America at the beginning of the 17th century. 100 years later, it had a contiguous set of 13 colonies running from New Hampshire in the north, south to Georgia. These colonies provided an increasingly rich vein of revenue for the British government, as cash crops in the shape of cotton, tobacco, and other items flowed in from the southern colonies, and trade flourished out of ports like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. To capture this growing wealth, the Crown government in England began imposing new taxes. These, in turn, provoked opposition in the colonies, as they did not have political representation at Westminster. Eventually, the tensions would boil over in the mid-1770s into outright rebellion, and as the American Revolutionary War proceeded, the colonists formed their own Continental Congress in Philadelphia and declared the creation of a new United States of America. The Crown was determined to try to reimpose British control over the colonies, but many parliamentarians in England believed that the war was either being mishandled or significantly sympathized with the grievances of the colonials. Burke would be chief amongst them and one of the strongest opponents of the government in Parliament in England during the American Revolutionary War. Already by the time he was elected as MP for Bristol, Burke had expressed his opposition to excessive taxation of the colonies in a speech which was subsequently published in January 1775 as "On American Taxation." In this, he had argued against North's government's excessive taxes and predicted the outbreak of war if the government persisted in its approach. In March 1775, when a negotiated peace in which the colonies would remain under British rule was still a possibility, he gave a speech before the House of Commons in which he urged reconciliation, laying out 6 distinct measures which needed to be undertaken to bring both sides back from the precipice. Firstly, the colonial community needed to be given political representation. Otherwise, their claim that taxation without representation was unjust could never be assuaged. The Crown and North's government needed to acknowledge their wrongdoing, An efficient means of nominating delegates from the colonies had to be put in place, and aid needed to be given to the colonies in certain circumstances. Finally, a General Assembly should be created in North America, one which would have oversight of taxation, while taxes themselves should never be onerous on the colonial community. It was, in brief, a call to treat the colonials as subjects of the Crown with the same rights as Englishmen, rather than as a community that could be viewed solely as a source of revenue. Unfortunately, none of Burke's ideas were listened to. Instead, when the Continental Congress sent a final olive branch petition to London to try to get the king to listen to their grievances in the summer of 1775, it was ignored. The Declaration of Independence would be adopted in Philadelphia a year later. By the late 1770s, Burke and many of the other Whigs were openly in support of American independence, claiming that not only had Lord North's government lost the moral argument, but that it was increasingly clear that they were going to lose the military argument as well. Against all odds, the colonials had created a substantial, professional army headed by George Washington, and subsequently acquired alliances with France and Spain, which allowed it to gain the upper hand on the British forces in North America. In the midst of all of this, the Gordon Riots, a series of popular and violent protests motivated by the proposed repudiation of anti-Catholic legislation, broke out in London and lasted for over a week. Hundreds of people were killed or injured in a wave of violence. The entire incident confirmed Burke in his belief in what we would now call liberal conservatism, the idea that one should strive towards the liberal and progressive ideas of the Enlightenment, but do so by appealing to conservative and traditional values, not attempting to quickly bring about change through violent means, but instead to seek incremental, measured reform. Whatever political approach he might take, though, would henceforth be from the constituency of Malton. In 1780, he lost his seat as a Bristol MP after his dedication to representing the interests of the nation above his constituency flew too many times in the face of the electors of the port city. He would serve as an MP for Malton for the rest of his time in Parliament. In the early winter of 1781, the news arrived to England of a major defeat of Lord Cornwallis and his troops at the siege of Yorktown in Virginia by a combined colonial and French army. With the defeat of the last major remaining British army in the 13 colonies, the American Revolutionary War was effectively at an end. So too was Lord North's time as Prime Minister. After 12 years in office, he was replaced in the spring of 1782. A major split with past policies was needed to now negotiate peace terms with the Americans, and North's replacement was none other than Lord Rockingham. As one of his closest political allies, Burke was brought into government, being appointed as Paymaster of the Armed Forces and also being given a seat as a Privy Councillor, though he was not made a member of Rockingham's cabinet. He was only to hold office for a short period of time, but was able to bring forward some considerable legislation nevertheless, notably the Paymaster General Act of 1782, which reformed the manner in which different government departments were able to hold monies for different government purposes. More broadly, he managed in the space of just a few months to abolish over 130 different offices in the civil administration and the royal establishment, ones which were deemed to be legacy perquisites that served no real function in a modern government. The reforms saved the government over £70,000 a year, a very substantial sum by the standards of the late 18th century. Thereafter, though, his efforts were quickly stymied as Rockingham died unexpectedly at just 52 years of age in July 1782, and after just over 3 months back in office as Prime Minister. With the end of the second Rockingham administration in the summer of 1782, Burke was back in opposition as the Earl of Shelburne became the new Prime Minister. This should, theoretically, have ended Burke's period as Paymaster of the Forces. However, Shelburne's premiership proved short-lived, and when a new coalition was put in place early in 1783, Burke was asked to resume the office of Paymaster. He would continue to hold this for some months to come, and so played an important official role in some of the demobilization and payment of pensions which was underway in 1783 as the American Revolutionary War came to an end and the Treaty of Paris was signed, whereby Britain formally acknowledged the independence of the United States. When he left the office of Paymaster in December 1783, it was the last time he would ever hold a significant political office, though he would continue to serve in Parliament. Other honours did follow, though, in the 1780s. He became a rector of the University of Glasgow for several years in the middle of this decade, while on a visit to Ireland in 1786, he was affirmed as one of the founding members of the Royal Irish Academy, which was established by Royal Charter that year. It was also the last time that he would ever visit Ireland. The 1780s were notable for Burke's emergence as an opponent of the slave trade. The slave trade had become enormously profitable in the 18th century for Britain, but vocal opposition movements to it had existed at all stages throughout its existence. In particular, the Quakers had maintained a position of strong opposition to the trade in enslaved humans. The abolition movement expanded in the 1770s, and by the 1780s there was a growing bloc of MPs in Parliament who were willing to express their view that the practice was unconscionable and contrary to the spirit of the Age of Enlightenment. Despite being an MP for Bristol, a port city which had profited enormously from the slave trade, Burke spoke fiercely in opposition to the practice when a motion for the abolition of it was brought before the Parliament in 1788. Here, he stated that, quote, "The slave trade was directly contrary to the interests of humanity, and that the state of slavery, however mitigated, was a state so improper, so degrading, and so ruinous to the feelings and capacities of human nature that it ought not to be allowed to exist." Burke also held the view that there should be no consultation with the owners of the slave plantations in the West Indies about any future proposed abolition, stating bluntly that there was no point in sounding out the opinion of a group who would obviously try to block any proposed abolition, so contrary would it be to their economic interest. He continued to support the leading abolitionist in Parliament, William Wilberforce, and voted in favour of a bill which Wilberforce put forward in 1791, one which was easily defeated at that time. While the war in North America came to an end in 1783, other colonial matters would soon replace it in Burke's interests, specifically events in India. England had long-standing interests in the Asian subcontinent, having begun acquiring trading concessions and small coastal colonies there as early as the mid-17th century. These were eclipsed, though, by developments since the mid-1750s. In a series of wars, officials such as Sir Robert Clive, an agent of the English East India Company, had won spectacular successes over the native sultans and other rulers in the northeast of the subcontinent around Bengal. There followed several decades of exponential expansion as the company swallowed up ever greater chunks of land and moved westwards towards conquering Delhi. In the process, the English East India Company became the most successful corporation in human history, a company which governed a massive region and administered the lives of tens of millions of people on behalf of its shareholders in London. Unsurprisingly, the opportunity for corrupt profiteering on behalf of company agents in London was enormous, and Burke would soon have his sights set on holding the company to account in England and seeking to root out corrupt practices amongst its most senior officials. There was a touch of personal vendetta when it came to Burke's crusade against the English East India Company in the 1780s. Back in the 1760s, his brother Richard had invested substantially in the company's shares, along with his cousin and close friend Will Burke. Their hubris had won Burke over, and he had invested a considerable proportion of his own money at that juncture in the company as well. This was at a time just 10 years after the English East India Company had won the famous Battle of Plassey in India and had begun expanding at a remarkable speed, and there was great interest in the company's shares in a similar vein to the share frenzy that occurred with the rise of businesses such as Apple, Tesla, or Nvidia in more recent times. Like modern speculative bubbles, the bubble around investment in the English East India Company eventually burst in 1769, an event known as the Bengal Bubble, which was soon followed by the British credit crisis of 1772. These were some of the very earliest examples of modern speculative bubbles and fiscal crises. Burke and his other family members lost a substantial amount of money. He was overextended for years thereafter, and the event had a lasting impact on his personal finances. He was never not in debt in his adult life. Thus, while there is no doubt that he was acting in good faith as a civically minded politician in the 1780s, he also had a personal grudge against the English East India Company and its agents. The individual who Burke's ire would fall upon in the 1780s was Sir Warren Hastings. Hastings had been appointed as the Governor-General of Bengal in 1772 and would serve in the position down to 1785. He and Robert Clive were by far the two most important individuals in the company's conquest of much of India. There is no doubt that he was somewhat corrupt, but in early modern times, corruption was entirely normal in political office. What was at issue when corruption arose was the severity of it. Enriching oneself in a modest fashion was considered a perquisite of office, but excessively doing so was not. In other ways, Hastings was a peculiar target. While Clive was a broadly uncultured brute who viewed India through the worst sort of colonial prism, Hastings was interested in Indian culture, writing extensively on the country and even venturing to publish the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Whatever Hastings' saving graces were, Burke was not won over by them. Others had already attempted to bring charges against him in England, and he was recalled from Bengal under a cloud of suspicion in 1785, though when he arrived to London, he was received warmly. Despite this, Burke stated his intention to bring a motion before Parliament concerning, quote, "a gentleman just returned from India." Burke began his efforts early in 1786. It took a year and a half before Hastings was arrested and charged. The trial would eventually open in February 1788, at which point Burke proceeded to deliver an opening address which ran through 4 days of business. Many of the charges he laid out focused on both Hastings' self-enrichment and his political actions, which Burke argued had undermined relations between the government and the native people, thus endangering Britain's vital national interests in India. There was enormous public interest in the trial in the initial stages, and people flocked to Westminster Hall to see the proceedings playing out. But over time, it simply petered out. It was adjourned for lengthy periods of time as the defendant requested leave to prepare his defence, and then, as the government became far more preoccupied with events on the continent where the French Revolution began in 1789. In the end, the case would be returned to intermittently over a period of nearly 7 years before a verdict was finally given. In it, Hastings was acquitted of all wrongdoing, although his career and life had been completely undermined in any event, having spent huge sums of money on his legal defence. Burke remained convinced of Hastings' guilt, but in retrospect the impeachment and trial appears to be one of his less justifiable endeavours and tinged with more than a little bit of personal spite at his own loss of money back at the time of the Bengal bubble of 1769. Even as the Hastings case was underway, Burke's career was being oriented in a new direction by events in France. In the early summer of 1789, the government of King Louis XVI had convened the French Estates General, a species of early modern parliament, at his Grand Palace of Versailles outside Paris. It was the first time a French parliament had been called in 175 years and is an indication of the dire financial situation the French state found itself in, that it was willing to have recourse to the estates to try to obtain a financial subsidy. However, matters quickly overtook the king and his ministers as the delegates began taking control of the government. By the midsummer, a full-blown revolution was underway. The French Revolution would intensify in the early 1790s, eventually leading to the trial and execution of King Louis XVI and the creation of a republic. As this occurred, a coalition of European powers who were opposed to the innovations being made in Versailles and Paris came into being. War broke out in 1792 as Britain, Austria and Prussia sought to overthrow the French Revolution. Britain would remain a stalwart opponent of the French for nearly a quarter of a century of war which followed. The outbreak of the French Revolution and its unfolding into 1790 inspired Burke to compose one of his most well-known works of all. Reflections on the Revolution in France was a pamphlet in which Burke sought to contrast the political revolution underway across the English Channel and the stated ideology of the French revolutionaries with the liberal conservatism of the unwritten British Constitution. In it, Burke made the case that the British system, with its blend of liberal and conservative values, the balancing of power between Parliament, the Crown, the Lords and the courts, much of it based on traditions which had developed over hundreds of years, was far preferable to the ideological extremism of the French Revolution. One of his central contentions was that the revolution in Paris was being driven by individuals putting forward arguments about abstract and universal rights. As he quipped in one passage, what was the point of making declarations about the universal rights to food, medicine, or anything of that sort, if the state did not have the practical systems and measures in place with which to deliver them. Instead, he affirmed his belief that chaos and extremism would soon ensue in France, and predicted that in the end a strong man or general would emerge who would seize power or would be given it by the French people in an effort to re-establish some stability. Though he lost support in some of the Whig factions for his arguments in the Reflections, on almost every single point he was to be proved correct. The revolution descended into violent bloodshed and disorder in 1793, and eventually, in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte would emerge as a military dictator of the French Republic. The Reflections is viewed as a classic statement of political science today. The Reflections point towards one of the most significant aspects of Burke as a thinker, politician, and historical figure, his role in the development of liberal conservatism. Liberal conservatism is a political outlook or ideology which broadly argues for a conservative approach to politics, but often with the goal of achieving liberal policies. For instance, a liberal conservative might believe that equality of freedoms and opportunity in social and economic spheres are desirable, but they may also stress that this should only be achieved with due respect to the rule of law and the maintenance of the cohesion of society. This was effectively what Burke was arguing for in the Reflections. Liberal conservatism also often focuses on economic issues, with people who are generally conservative on a wide range of social and political matters arguing in favour of inherently liberal economic policies. Burke epitomized this in the 18th century, being a keen advocate of free trade at a time when protectionism was still mainstream throughout Europe. Burke was one of the foundational figures in the emergence of liberal conservatism in the age of the Enlightenment, others being Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, the British Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, and slightly later utilitarian writers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Yet, while these figures were all important, Burke stands virtually alone with the French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville in terms of the clarity and eloquence with which he outlined the idea of liberal conservatism. As a political ideology, its influence has been immense, and it is central to the ideological outlook of centre-right political parties all over the world today. This is where much of Burke's significance as a historical figure lies. So much of his life away from it. In 1789, a Catholic committee had been established there to petition on behalf of the Catholic majority of the country for them to have a greater share of political power and economic interest on the island. The following year, they approached Burke, who they knew would be sympathetic to their cause, and requested that he favour a proposal for his son, Richard Burke, by then a man in his early 30s, to become their agent. Richard would then lobby the government for repeal of the anti-Catholic penal laws in Ireland and relief of Catholics in general. Burke approved the arrangement and took up the cause himself, publishing a Letter to Sir Hercules Langrish in March 1792. This was ostensibly a letter to a fellow member of Parliament, but due to Burke's desire that it be published for the general public to read, it set out the argument in favour of Catholic emancipation in Ireland in a manner that made it accessible for a wider audience, attacking the Protestant ascendancy in the process. Ultimately, the endeavour would not meet with success, and though Burke himself would not live to see it, a fresh revolt in Ireland in 1798, with the aid of the French revolutionary government, would convince the Crown that it needed to dispense altogether with Ireland's legislative independence. The Dublin Parliament was dissolved through 2 Acts of Union in 1800 that came into effect. While his efforts in Ireland met with perennial failure, in Britain in the mid-1790s, Burke's hope for a coalition between the anti-French Portland Whigs and Pitt's administration finally came to fruition. A coalition agreement was reached in January 1794, yet while Burke had been one of the principal architects of this realignment in British parliamentary politics, he was not included in the negotiations to form the new administration, nor did Pitt and Portland intend for him to play a senior role within it. Much of this was owing to his age. Burke was in his mid-60s by then, an aging figure by the standards of the time, and suffering from an ailment for several years, which was almost certainly advanced stomach cancer. He intended to retire before the Conservatives, the Whigs, the Irish Repeal Party, which was seeking the re-establishment of a separate Irish Parliament, and the Chartist Party, the latter of which was the first embryonic form of a socialist party in Britain, one which was appalled by the urban squalor and poverty which had ensued from industrialization and wanted reform of workers' rights. This drift would continue over the rest of the 19th century, with new parties coming and going. Often, these could switch sides and form new alliances with each other based on differing viewpoints on different topics, while independent groupings within the major parties might emerge to offer support to others where they felt strongly on individual issues. In short, a more open political system, based on the parties but also on political conscience, was in evidence. Burke had done more than most to ensure the emergence of such a system, with his perennial desire to walk his own line and take strong stances on the most important matters of the day. Edmund Burke can be considered a somewhat underappreciated figure today in light of his enormous importance in British parliamentary history. Many people with just a passing knowledge of the history of 18th century Europe